Bob Madle, our fan guest of honor, is perhaps not as well known to the current 3 or 4 generations of fans as he was 100 years ago. He is an authentic survivor, a dinosaur of the Eofanish era. He was going to science fiction conventions. In fact, he was organizing science fiction conventions before there was a Worldcon. First Worldcon was in 1939. Madle had a hand in the Philadelphia conferences that took place between 1492 and 1507. Actually, I'm sure many of you have read Sam Moskowitz's 39-page introduction to Madle in the program booklet. For the benefit of those of you who haven't, I propose to read it now, and then I will let Bob speak. Madle, one of the founders of the Fantasy Amateur Press Association, one of the early fanzine publishers, a scholar of science fiction. Incidentally, in the program booklet there is quite a charming essay by Madle on his particular golden age of science fiction. I think it was Peter Graham, unless it was Terry Carr, who coined the wondrous epigram, the golden age of science fiction is when you're 12 years old. Well, for Madle it happened a little late. I think he was 14. But there is that wonderful nostalgic essay on 1934, the greatest year in science fiction, in the program booklet, and I commend it all to you. I have my reservations about the underlying thesis, but I thought 1934 was okay, but anyway, Bob Madle, not only early fan, guiding spirit of Eastern fandom for many years, poet, philosopher, swordsman, collaborator with E.E. Smith on the Lensman series, collaborated with H.P. Lovecraft on many short stories, including The Shadow Out of Brooklyn and I Remember Philadelphia. Madle was, I believe, one of the very first Taft delegates. His list of accomplishments within the Fanish microcosm would fill, in fact, Sam Moskowitz's 34-page introduction, and did. I commend that to you, too, as a study in biography. Bob, come up here now and try to justify your choice as fan guest of honor at the SunCon. Bob Madle, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks a lot, Bob. In the program book, Harlan Ellison tells all about Bob Silverberg, but there are still a few secrets that even Harlan didn't reveal. These hitherto unrevealed facts are concerned with Bob's early writing career, and I guarantee them to be 100% authentic. Silverberg story number 1. You know how it is when you're a young, enthusiastic fan, how you want to grow up and meet your favorite author. But how many fans grew up to be their favorite author? Well, back in the early 50s, Bob's favorite writer was one Ivar Jorgensen, who appeared quite often in Amazing Stories and Fantastic. By 1954, Bob started selling stories to Amazing Stories, and 2 of them appeared in the magazine at the same time. One under the name of Ivar Jorgensen, which turned out to be an Amazing Stories house name. Silverberg story number 2. About this time, Bob was informed by one of his editors that you can't make it as a science fiction writer with a Jewish name. So Bob selected the surnames of John Calvin and John Knox, 2 of the original white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in America, and coined the name Calvin Knox. He used it about 30 times until, it is rumored, some editor informed him that you can't make it anymore in science fiction with a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant name. Okay, away from Bob Silverberg for a few minutes and on to other things. What I'm going to do is briefly mention some of the most memorable incidents that have occurred to me since I became a science fiction fan. And like all fan historians, I must mention the first science fiction magazine I ever bought. It was the summer of 1933, and I saw it hanging in a window of a backdate magazine store. It showed a marvelous scene of a large moon hovering over the earth with the oceans washing away New York City. It was the February 1933 wonder, and the cover was by Frank R. Paul, and it cost me 5 cents to buy it. I first had to go home and talk my mother into giving me the nickel. I guess I was pretty lucky, because it was less than a year and a half later that I discovered the existence of fan magazines when I sent for a free copy of Fantasy magazine, which I still think is the greatest of them all. Can you imagine the thrill I got out of reading interviews with F. Orland Tremaine and Elliot Gould, finding out what future issues of the mags would contain, and learning all the inside stuff about science fiction? I saved up my dime-a-day lunch money for a week so I could subscribe to it. I even sent in an article which editor Julia Schwartz rejected as, quote, imparting nothing new, unquote. Of course, at age 14, I had no idea what was new or old. One of the articles I recall from one of those early issues of Fantasy magazine was by Wonder Stories editor Charles D. Hornig, titled Stories We Reject. Among those listed were Triplanetary by E. E. Smith and Flight on Titan by Stanley G. Weinbaum. I guess I was very impressed that anyone would have the audacity to reject stories like these. Another big moment in my early SF life was meeting for the first time with Milt Rothman, Ozzie Train, and other Philly fans, and helping to form the Philadelphia Science Fiction League. This meeting inspired John Baladonis, Jack Agnew, and I to get out the first issue, October 1935, of Imaginative Fiction, a carbon-copied fan magazine. Of course, it was a carbon copy of Fantasy magazine, and as such, had the usual news column. One of the items mentioned was that one of the Philadelphia members had just returned from a CCC camp. He was quite upset about this because not only did he not want anyone to know he had returned from a CCC camp, he didn't even want anyone to know he had been to one. He was one of the older members of the club, too, probably almost 20. Another interesting thing occurred at this meeting. Milt Rothman showed me a story that had been rejected by Wonder. Now, Wonder's editor, Charles D. Hornig, was encouraging new writers, and his comment on this story was, if we were giving prizes for stories, this would receive the prize as the most hackneyed story of the month. Inspired by reading this comment, I went home and wrote a story that weekend titled Devolution and shipped it off to Wonder Stories. It was quickly returned with the comment that if he were to publish this story, it would mean that the readers would demand all stories to be of such excellence, which of course would be impossible, and it would result in the end of Wonder Stories. He did attach a P.S. in which he stated that it would be preferable not to type future stories single-spaced on school notebook paper. And then occurred the event that for sheer magnitude in the minds of young teenagers has never been equaled. One evening, Milt Rothman came racing over to my house, ecstatically waving a letter from Charles D. Hornig, informing us that he and Julia Schwartz, editor of Fantasy magazine, were going to visit us the following Saturday afternoon. Even now, it is difficult to describe our amazement and enthusiasm. I guess it would be akin to several of the Greek gods dropping down from Valhalla to chit-chat with a few of the peasants. For in 1935, there had been little, if any, city-to-city contact among science fiction readers. And to have one of the science fiction editors actually visit us, well, this bordered on the unbelievable. So I can still remember very vividly Baladonis, Agnew, and I walking through a raging snowstorm for several miles to meet at Rothman's house and greet the two editors. And we all sat around on the floor and listened in awe as they told us many strange and wondrous things. I guess after that visit, everything else that occurred to me was downhill. It was just a short time later, October 1936, that a most important event occurred. The members of the International Scientific Association, a New York fan group, advised the Philadelphia group they were visiting us. Gosh, wow, boy, oh boy. Coming at one time were such as Donald A. Wollheim, David A. Kyle, Frederick Pohl, William Sikora, and quite a few others. It was a grand and glorious day, culminating in a meeting at Rothman's house, where Donald Wollheim made the now legendary statement, "Why don't we call this the first science fiction convention?" And so it was. And plans were then laid for a super world convention, the same afternoon plans were laid, to be held in New York City in conjunction with the World's Fair in 1939. Of course, the World's Fair wouldn't know anything about it. From a strictly personal viewpoint, one of my biggest thrills came when I submitted a contest entry on what can I do to promote science fiction to Throwing Wonder Stories in early 1937. You can imagine how stunned I was when I opened up the April 1937 Wonder and found my entry printed there as the first prize winner. This was indeed a traumatic experience for my constant companion and science fiction rival, John Balladonist, who modestly blurted out at this point, "If I had entered, I would have won." Then, of course, there are the early memories of the 1939 NICON, the first Worldcon. 200 fans and writers getting together for the first time. Meeting Ackerman, Bradbury, and numerous others. Attending the banquet honoring the immortal Frank R. Paul. The cost of the banquet was $1, and only 30 of the attendees were affluent enough to buy a ticket. Jack Agnew and I were enthusiastically telling Paul how he was the greatest artist in the history of the world when he said, "Take this note to Hugo Gernsback and tell him I said to give each of you a cover illustration." Gads, a message from Paul to Gernsback, the elder god, about us. Unbelievable. But we went and gave the note to Hugo. He left the room for a moment, returned and said, "The owner of the covers said they will cost you $10 each." $10. He might as well have said 10,000. And at that moment, one of the greatest gods of them all crumbled and dissipated into dust in front of our very eyes. Then there were the second and third pre-war conventions, Chi-Con and Denvention, and the rides across country in Art Widner's Foo-Foo special. And the startling fact that Julius Unger actually paid for a hotel room rather than use the normal method of sleeping in the car. It had always been one of my dreams to have an actual Philadelphia Science Fiction Society clubroom. And after World War II, this dream became an actuality. The club was growing, and we obtained a basement apartment in West Philadelphia. It was this group that put on PhilCon 1, the first con to have progress reports and big open room parties. The two new specialty publishers, Hadley and Fantasy Press, tried to outdo each other in this respect. PhilCon 1 also sponsored Ackerman's creation, the Big Pond Fund, which was in reality the beginning of the Transatlantic Fund, more commonly known as TAF. I guess another great moment in my fandish life was when I received a letter from Bob Lowndes telling me he was going to use an article in Science Fiction Quarterly that Sam Moskowitz and I had written, First Professional Acceptance. This resulted in several other articles and finally a regular department inside Science Fiction, which ran in his various magazines for about 7 years and which was actually nominated for a Hugo in 1956. At that time, feature writing was so prominent in the 30 or 40 science fiction magazines that were being published that there were a sufficient number of people writing that a Hugo could be nominated. I didn't win it, though. Willie Lay did. Then began my nomadic days of moving from Philadelphia to Charlotte, to Maryland, to Indianapolis, and in each city there were fans, and we formed science fiction clubs. These were fun days and fun clubs. In Charlotte, Our meeting place was the bar room of the Charlotte Hotel. And in Indianapolis, we actually had a bar in operation at the Indianapolis Club. Then in 1957, I was nominated as one of the Taft candidates. There was quite a ruckus among some of the active fanzine fans when I won, and one of them said, "Madle is a fake fan and couldn't write a convention report if he had to." And at that point, I determined that my report would be titled "A Fake Fan in London," and would be the longest convention report ever written. And so it was. It ran for 10 installments in Lynn Hickman's magazine, J.D. Argosy. Today, I suppose, I am more noted for my connection with First Fandom than with anything else. The idea of First Fandom came up when a group of Indiana and Ohio fans got together at Doc Barrett's medical offices in 1958. I came up with the idea, so the boys appointed me president. I am still president, mainly because it takes 51% of the membership to sign a ballot calling for a new election. And can you imagine getting 51% of First Fandom to sign anything? Lou Tabakow suggested this constitutional item based on his experience as president of the Cincinnati Club. For 25 years, he has refused to officially call a meeting to order, and no one can kick him out unless he does so. Then I received an award at the 1973 DisCon. It was the E.E. Evans Big Heart Award. Now let me tell you something about awards. With the Hugo and the J.W. Campbell Award, you are well aware that you might win the award. Some of the awards you know you've won. But the E.E. Evans Award comes as a complete shock. And the first time you have even an inkling is when you say to yourself, "That guy's talking about me." This kind of an award is very bad for a veteran fan's heart. Anyway, I've tried to mention some of the memorable moments in my fanish science fiction life. And here I have now been given the ultimate award, Fan Guest of Honor. And as I look out upon all the hundreds of your friendly faces, I can't even say it is a proud and lonely thing to be a fan. But I can think to myself, where would I have been? What would I have done? Who would I have known if I had never discovered science fiction? Thank you very much.
This is a special fan guest of honor, Hugo. That
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Bob Madle, fan guest of honor. Thank you for those wonderful, if slightly apocryphal, Robert Silverberg stories. You missed one essential aspect of the Calvin Knox story. I did indeed choose Calvin and Knox as the most Protestant-sounding names I could put together. But the full byline, as some of you know, was Calvin M. Knox. And when John Campbell, who was the editor who finally asked me what was going on here, heard the story, he said, "And what does the M stand for?" "Moses," I said. All right, now I have a tough job. I have to introduce Jack Williamson, our pro guest of honor. Now, as you know, my style as a platform performer is a little on the waspish side. I have a little fun with the people that I'm introducing. I poke fun at them, I tease, I distort, I'm malicious. Tomorrow at the banquet when I introduce Son of Sam, it'll be easy for me. But it is hard to poke fun at Jack Williamson. It's a little like poking fun at Obi-Wan Kenobi. You don't get away with it. Now, I've had this job before. 1971 Worldcon, where I was Toastmaster, I had to introduce Clifford D. Simak. And if there is a nicer, sweeter, gentler, more lovable man in this world than Clifford D. Simak, it is, I guess, Jack Williamson. Nevertheless, I managed to be snide about Clifford D. Simak. And when Cliff stood up when I finished, by the way, I talked about his achievements. After 15 minutes of talking about his gambling exploits on the Mississippi, I talked about his achievements as a science fiction writer, and Cliff said, with the sweetness and gentleness that is his hallmark, "Thank you, Bob, for all the nice things you said about me." Well, I'll try to say a few nice things about Jack before I let him come up and take a shot at me. Jack Williamson, well, this has been a long time in coming, Jack Williamson as guest of honor at a science fiction convention. I am, not exactly a brand new science fiction writer. I think of myself as a relatively young man, but I've been writing this stuff for 20, 25 years. Jack Williamson was a superstar in science fiction before I was born. Back in Bob Madle's golden year of 1934, Jack Williamson was already up there at the top of the pantheon. Here we are 79 years later, and they finally get around to making him a Worldcon guest of honor, which has always seemed to me a great injustice, now finally remedied. One of the few really satisfactory things that this convention committee has achieved. That didn't come out exactly right, but Jack, of course, is of old Western stock, born in some sun-baked arroyo under Apache arrows and Comanche bombardment, raised in a covered wagon somewhere between the Gadsden Purchase and Baja California. Sold his first story to Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories in 1873. I mean, he's been around. Actually, I think it was 1928, which is long enough ago, really, honestly. The Metal Man, I believe. Metal Man? Well, whatever. One of those titles, one of those science fiction-y titles. If you don't know Jack Williamson's accomplishments as a science fiction writer, you don't know science fiction. If you have not read The Humanoids, that marvelous novelette about robots, if you have not read With Folded Hands is the novelette, The Humanoids is the novel. If you have not read The Legion of Space, which is about a fat, jovial, beer-drinking man just like me, named Giles Habibula, and a lot of other guys who go off to the far end of the universe and have wondrous adventures. I saw last night a paperback edition of The Legion of Space at one of the pro-publisher cocktail parties. Just coming out again, this book, which is, I think, 43 years old. It's a book that will live forever. As long as anyone is reading science fiction, somebody will be putting out a paperback of The Legion of Space. I will pass over quickly the erotic fiction in Marvel Tales that he ghosted under the names of Henry Miller and D.H. Lawrence. Temptress of the Purple Void and Space Breasts of the Third Galaxy. These were accomplishments not to be ignored, perhaps to be apologized for, but in a career that is as long as Jack Williamson's, you are entitled to make a few horrid blunders, and I suppose Jack has made them now and then. Relatively fewer, though, than law of averages would allow. Aside from being a science fiction writer who has remained active over an extraordinary span of nearly 50 years, growing, changing, staying with it, remaining as fresh and vigorous a storyteller in 1977 as he was in 1928. Jack has other accomplishments within the science fiction world as a scholar, as a teacher, at relatively advanced age, putting himself back through college, getting an advanced degree, becoming professor of literature at East New Mexico State, I believe it is. I was going to make up a funny name, but East New Mexico State is funny enough. Writing a doctoral thesis on H.G. Wells, which has been published as a book. Retaining through his academic career that same easy, all-shucks charm. Nothing stuffy about this man. He will come up and try to be stuffy. He's going to do his best. He's going to give us some long, dull speech because he feels that's what's expected of him. But if he just stood up here and did a few Jack Williamson all-shuckses, it would be much more effective. Oh, hell. This is one of our great men. This is one of our authentic grandmasters, and it is about 15 years after the time when it should have been said. I ask you to stand and welcome the Worldcon guest of honor, Jack Williamson.
Thank you all, and thank you, Bob. I owe Bob a special debt of gratitude. I yield to no one in my admiration for him as a writer, an editor, an MC, an all-around human being, but I also have an enormous respect for him. I've seen him cut a number of eminent science fiction writers completely to shreds, and I feel deeply grateful for the presentation here, which was sort of unbelievable. Some of the things he said make me feel sort of weak and shuddery inside, and I haven't quite recovered yet. Before I get to anything else, I have a note here that I want to pass along to say, don't forget to remind them about the blood drive. And this is autographed by Jerry Parnell, by Virginia Heinlein, by Robert Heinlein, by Larry Niven, by Ted Sturgeon. And as you know, the blood drive is taking place, I believe, in the back of the Huckster room. And blood donors are rewarded by autographs. And I want to recommend this wholeheartedly. It will be going on, I think, until 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon. And coming to the long, dull, ponderous academic speech that Bob promised and that I very seriously intend to try to deliver, why, here, as Bob was saying, it's a long time since I discovered science fiction. I've had about 50 years of experience in it, and on the basis of that, for extrapolation, I want to speculate on the next century of science fiction. As a one-time military weather forecaster, I've had a lot of experience in the way that forecasts can go wrong, so I'm prepared for error. But I've also had a certain experience in how to hedge, and since I'm talking about the next 100 years, well, it'll take quite a while to prove that I'm completely wrong. And it seems to me that this is maybe not a very important project, but it strikes me also as an interesting project. Science fiction has changed a good deal since I discovered Amazing Stories in the fall of 1926. And so have I changed. I was 18 then. I was just out of a country high school. I was still living with my parents on a sandhill homestead in eastern New Mexico, about 30 miles from the county seat town. I was dreaming vaguely of some better world to come, but without much visible prospect of getting there. My dad and my uncle had some old stray encyclopedias and old physics books and so forth that I'd read, and I was aware of science as an exciting activity, but nobody was willing to finance a scientific education. I'd seen advertisements of Mark Twain's works and learned that he got $1 a word, and it struck me it'd be wonderful to be a writer, but nobody was offering me $1 a word. My imagination had been turned on by a few stray books such as Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee, but my reading had been pretty short. I had at one time and another dreamed up long stories of my own amazement that I told my brother and sister sometimes when we were working in the field, but nobody else had been very much impressed, and I needed some sort of lucky strike, and when it happened, why, it was an introduction to science fiction through Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories that had begun publication that spring. The first copy I saw was the property of a friend. It was the November issue with this arc of space illustrating Garrett P. Service, the second deluge. But I didn't have a quarter to buy another one, and I didn't really get impressed with the magazine until a little bit later. There was a little farm magazine called The Pathfinder that was offering in an advertisement free copies, and I answered the ad. I got a free copy of the magazine. It was the March issue for 27. It featured the green splotches, a perfectly wonderful space story by P.S. Stribling that, so far as I know, has never been reprinted, with a tall cover that showed a spaceship operated by green plant men taking off from Earth from their home world on the planet Jupiter. And inside there was A. Merritt's People of the Pit, a story that still haunts me, and one installment of Edgar Rice Burroughs' The Land That Time Forgot, which was a far more wonderful story than it was as a recent motion picture. And I was completely wonderstruck. It's hard to imagine the impact that had on me then, because today, why, we're completely saturated with science fiction. If a kid watches the Saturday morning TV shows, why, he sees over and over again the wonderful plots that were so completely new to me then. But anyway, well, that tall cover lifted me out of the little world where I had felt I'd been trapped. I'd caught the science fiction bug, and I never really got over it. I persuaded my sister to help pay for a subscription to Amazing when it began. It was the May issue, I think, that had the second installment of A. Merritt's Moon Pool, which probably hit me harder than any other story I ever read. I borrowed an old typewriter and started writing my own science fiction and sending it off. And some of these early manuscripts still survive in the special collection at Eastern New Mexico University. One of them is written on the back of a scrap of wallpaper. Most of them were never finished, but I did send off 3 or 4. They came back with rejection slips. But finally, there was one that didn't come back, and that fall I was passing by a newsstand, and the title was The Metal Man, and I recognized my metal man on the cover of the magazine, and suddenly I was a writer. And I've been, let's say, sort of committed to science fiction ever since. My, let's say, dedication to the field seemed pretty unwise to my parents, and it should have been looked insane to me. Amazing had begun as a reprint publication. I don't know what Gernsback paid for reprint stories, but I soon discovered he wasn't very anxious to pay very much for new stories. When I saw The Metal Man in print, I estimated that probably I'd get $500 for the story, and when I eventually got paid, it was $25. But I still remain committed. There was no book market for science fiction in those days. There were occasional volumes by H.G. Wells or Mayard or Conan Doyle. There were no TV shows, of course, no radio shows, no comic strips, and there had been such memorable science fiction fields as Metropolis, but I've never even heard of them, and generally science fiction wasn't a very promising field for a green farm boy, but gradually things got better. Science fiction soon became a pulp category. Amazing that with the reprints it begun, I think, as something better than a pulp magazine, and with the amateurish fiction that Gunsback got for what he paid, why, it was probably soon something worse than a pulp. But in 1930, Harry Bates became the editor of Astounding Stories of Super Science, which has evolved through the years into Analog, which was a pulp magazine, part of the Clayton pulp chain, written and edited by professionals who were fairly paid. I've always respected the pulps as a fine training ground for new writers, but they were not very sophisticated. I think the letter columns of the old magazines give you a pretty good idea of what the typical reader was. He was young, he was male, he was pretty bright, but he didn't have much money or much education. And the preferred style was simple. The plots stressed savage action, and the themes reflected a pretty optimistic expectation that wonderful worlds were coming. And rather rapidly, all that changed. The readers grew up, they learned more, they earned more. And I think World War II was a major turning point. It pulled a whole generation of us out of wherever we were. It exposed us to all sorts of experiences all over the world, sometimes more experience than we could take, and it shattered a lot of old dream worlds. The spaceships had been pretty wonderful, but the first actual spaceships were the V-2 rockets that rained down on London. We'd been writing about atomic wars since H.G. Wells, but I think we've generally seen the atom as furnishing power for paradise, and the real atom appeared as the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think science fiction has never been the same again. John Campbell, of course, had been the major science fiction editor through the late 1930s, the war years, and we've heard a great deal about the Golden Age. He was, I think, first of all, a lover of technology. He was generally an optimist, or wanted to be, about science and the future. He wanted his stories solved, problems solved in a good way if possible. But by 1950, he had two outstanding rivals, Tony Boucher with fantasy and science fiction, and Horace Gold with Galaxy. And Tony wanted more literary grace and subtlety than John cared about, and Horace was less the optimist and interested less in technology and more in the psychological and social consequences of technology, and generally seen in a rather alarmist way. And the history of science fiction since about 1950 is so familiar that I won't say much about it, but certainly it's kept on growing, it's kept on capturing new media. Charlie Brown's tally of the published books is getting pretty near 1,000 a year. We have Star Trek and now Star Wars, and all sorts of people have discovered sources of revenue in science fiction that weren't visible at all in 1926. And on this basis of extrapolation, I want to attempt to look ahead toward the next century. And first of all, I want to set up some sort of basis for projection. And this depends on your concept of what science fiction is. And the critics have never been able to agree on a definition, and the label is applied to all sorts of things. That is, there isn't much you can say about Edgar Rice Burroughs that you can also say about Chip Delaney and Dahlgren. But to me, hard science fiction has a real link to science. It's about what is not true here and now, but what might be possible somewhere. And fantasy, on the contrast, is, let's say, it requires the acceptance of the outright impossible. If you're accepting this sort of thing, why you're accepting change, and I like to think about science fiction then as a response to progress in science and technology. Looking at it this way, why, it's less than 2 centuries old. The historians in the academic field, including myself, who want to go farther back and talk about Homer and various others, but to writers before, let's say, the idea of evolution was seriously accepted, before the Industrial Revolution, weren't seriously concerned with change because change wasn't moving fast enough to be visible. Brian Aldiss has suggested that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, is the really first important bit of science fiction. If we look at this sort of approach a little bit more closely, I think we can see 3 stages in the process of change. First of all, there's the new fact, new idea. For one famous example, Einstein's equation that E equals mc squared. And the next step takes us from theory to practice. The technician takes the abstract thought, he turns it into hardware, and this often takes something like a generation. That is, it was 40 years between Einstein's equation and the first atomic explosions. And finally, the next stage is the social consequences, the impacts on our lives. And in our real world today, why we have the engineers developing better bombs and new ideas for reactors, and we have activists and salt talks and so forth, that we're still attempting to resolve the impact of Einstein. And with this sort of an approach, I think we can make some reasonable forecasts about the future history of science fiction on the principle that anything is happening is likely to keep on happening, which is a basic for weather forecasting, while the method is to trace out the past and to project trends from the past into the future. To begin with the abstractions, the new ideas, why, certainly for the last 50 years, new knowledge, new ideas have been reshaping science fiction. When I began writing, you could still place a story and the blank spots on the map and Arabia, Australia, or somewhere else, and this may have been stretching the geography a little bit, but readers would accept it. You could still accept the steamy jungles on Venus and the ancient cities built by the canal builders of Mars, and steadily through the last 50 years, why the growth of knowledge has been pushing science fiction off the Earth and out of the solar system, and always opening new frontiers to make up for those that closed. For example, when I started, the universe was pretty small compared to what it is now. Hubble didn't discover the red shift and the expansion of the universe until 1929. And with most of the scientists who ever lived still thinking, we're certain to know a lot more about the world in 2077 than we do today. Milton Rothman, in a current article, is asking whether physics is finished, whether the physicists have at last explained the origin and the nature and the future of our whole material universe, maybe as the logical and necessary consequences of one big bang. And if life is the phenomena of the energy flow from a star, with all its potentials depending on the nature of matter and energy and space, why, when we've come to understand the laws of physics and their biological corollaries and so forth, when we know the limits of evolution here on Earth and on the farthest star, why, there won't be many surprises for space explorers. But then on the other hand, maybe physics isn't finished, maybe not even half finished. When I first learned about atoms, there were still the little planetary systems that Ray Cummings was exploring in The Girl of the Golden Atom. And steadily since then, the models have become more and more complex. We've discovered or produced a good many hundred nuclear particles, and these, it now turns out, may be composed of quarks. And the quark seems to behave, is thought to behave, like a mathematical point. And if it is a mathematical point, there's no room for anything else inside. And there's no way, even in theory, to examine an individual quark